We have done hundreds of presentations throughout the United States, and during our presentations, our audience tends to have some great questions. Do you mind answering some of those questions from our listeners right now?
Yeah, let's do it.
What advice can you give me when it comes to dealing with a building that has all glass?
Yeah, super good question. And it's something we come in contact with her. Our question we get almost everywhere we go. And because honestly, about 99% of the places we go into have glass entries and a lot of glass. Some of the biggest mistakes we see organizations make is treating a termination. It's like, a routine HR task instead of having a plan to risk manage the event. These terminations are one of the highest risk moments in any workplace. They're emotional. A few things to think about is
All right, welcome to Iron and Empathy, the podcast where we explore what it truly takes to build strong, resilient teams in high-stakes environments. I'm your host, Drew Moldenhauer. This show is about forging teams with grit, discipline, and accountability, while intentionally building empathy, trust, and psychological safety so people can communicate openly, perform under pressure, and look out for one another when it matters most. Iron and Empathy is proudly sponsored by Blue Ethos Specialized Training, a national leader in workplace violence prevention, active threat preparedness, and de-escalation training. At Blue Ethos, we don't just focus on safety. We help organizations improve workplace culture by strengthening communication, increasing situational awareness, and creating environments where people feel supported, empowered, and prepared to intervene early before problems escalate. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's conversation. With me today, I have a special guest, Rich Webb. Rich Webb is the co-founder of Blue Ethos Specialized Training and brings 18 years of law enforcement experience into his work today. During his career, Rich served in a variety of high responsibility roles, including patrol sergeant, mobile field force leader, and hostage negotiator, positions that require decisive leadership, calm communication, and sound judgment under extreme pressure. In 2014, he was awarded the Minnesota Chiefs of Police Medal of Honor for his actions during a life-threatening, high-stress incident on the steps of a daycare, an experience that helped shape his commitment to preparation, teamwork, and leadership when it mattered most. Now retired from law enforcement, Rich works full-time with Blue Ethos Specialized Training, where he has trained audiences across the United States, helping organizations strengthen situational awareness, improve communication under stress, and build safer, more resilient teams. Rich, we have done hundreds of presentations throughout the United States, and during our presentations, our audience tends to have some great questions related right to our work. Do you mind answering some of those questions from our listeners right now?
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. Okay, so we have a couple questions here from our audience and our listeners out there, and we'll just kick it off with the first one. Our building has a lot of glass. We have glass entrances, glass exits, and glass walls, and it honestly worries me. I keep thinking that if an active assailant came into the building, they could just shoot right through it. What advice can you give me when it comes to dealing with a building that has all glass?
Yeah, super good question. And it's something we come in contact with her. Our question we get almost everywhere we go. And because honestly, about 99% of the places we go into have glass entries and a lot of glass. So not unusual at all. The key thing we always recommend is really to focus on those main entry points. You can use security film on the glass, slow down anyone trying to break in. That's usually step one. The other reality is even with locks or buttons, if there is a real active threat, glass isn't going to keep somebody out forever. So a good example of that would be to YouTube the Nashville school shooter from a few years ago and watch how fast they actually enter that school, that locked facility with glass. It's really only a few seconds. So really a locked glass door only buys you a couple seconds in a true active threat. So that's why we really emphasize that multi-option response plan to get out, to barricade, to act with aggression. It's about having these layers of preparedness and not just relying on a glass entry or a glass lock.
Yeah, and that's where when you and I go and we do these presentations, a lot of the things that we talk about is just getting to know your places. You can't avoid all the glass in certain areas, but what could you find as cover versus concealment in those particular areas? And if you do have a lot of glass, maybe that's not the greatest place to actively barricade. Maybe you need to get out of there quicker, or maybe, it's one of those things where you have to act with aggression. So when you're looking at our multi-option response, maybe the actively barricade isn't the best feature for you during that time. So that is why we say get comfortable with your workplaces and knowing if this happened by my office or if this happened in this hallway, there's a lot of glass here, probably can't use that for any type of cover or concealment. We need to get out of there as quick as possible. Would you agree, Rich?
Exactly. We were saying, like, when we go through that multi-option response and get out barricade, act with aggression, there's no order where you'd start on that list. There's going to be areas that you can't barricade. You're going to want to try to get out of as fast as you can, or if you find yourself on a bus or on an airplane, you can't barricade yourself on an airplane, you can't get out of an airplane, so you might actually have to start with that act with aggression. So that's why we like to say it is that multi-option response, and there's no starting at A, B. I mean, it's kind of that fluid. And as you're walking around your spaces, you're almost running these mental rehearsals of thinking, okay, my office is all glass, so I can't barricade this. So here's my option. I can get out as fast as I can. I can grab an improvised weapon as I'm leaving and working towards that poster.
Perfect. All right. Next question. I've noticed at work, I sometimes get myself worked up over small things. And before I know it, I am reacting emotionally and not always rationally. I don't want to snap at my boss or coworkers. What advice would you give for slowing things down and de-escalating myself before it turns into a bigger issue? I'll take this one to start. So this is something that we get very common. And as a police officer of 18 years, done a lot of de-escalation training out there. And a lot of the de-escalation training that I have been through as a CIT instructor is really focusing on de-escalating others. They don't spend a lot of time, though, teaching us how to de-escalate ourselves. And one of the things I just want people to understand from this, because this is such a great question, is we have to get ourselves in check before we can de-escalate others. And it's good to know this because when we are dealing with someone, we can understand what their frame of mind and what's biologically happening in their brain when they're worked up. So one of the things I just want to talk about is if you can imagine with me when you're driving down the road and someone cuts you off in traffic, or you get that passive-aggressive email or text message from a supervisor or a friend, and I were to say to you just during that moment when you get that really passive-aggressive email, and I say, respond to that right now, that is probably going to be a very irrational response at that time. And here's what's happening in your brain when those times where you get cut off in traffic or you get that passive-aggressive email where you start to get a little escalated. We are all wired for survival, which is pretty cool. And that is why we are here today. Through evolution, we survived. When we have a real fear response or something happened to us where we get that cut off in traffic or that bad email, we have adrenaline that starts filling our veins. That adrenaline keeps us so that we can run faster, jump higher. If we are getting attacked, it really helps us fight a little bit stronger for a couple minutes. We also have cortisol, which is a stress hormone. It'll start filling our veins as well. And that was intended so that when the saber-toothed tiger would bite us back in the day, that we wouldn't bleed out right away. So those are good things to have happening to us because we're wired for survival. But the negative drawback to that is the same situation when this happens, when you get that bad email and you have an adrenaline cortisol filling your vein, what happens is it shuts off the process to your prefrontal cortex, which is your rational way of thinking, your rational brain. That part is shut off. So you will do some things that you may regret later. If you can think about it, maybe the last time that you and your significant other or you and your kid got into an argument, you might have yelled at your kid or your significant other. And then later, about 20 minutes later, you went and apologized for your actions. That's because that prefrontal cortex is off. And on average, this happens to people and it lasts for about 20 minutes. So you have this little thing inside of your brain called your amygdala, and that amygdala controls your fight-flight response, but it sometimes can't tell the difference between a grizzly bear out in the woods coming at you or a bad email. The response is the same. So one of the ways that I would explain to you to help you during these situations is box breathing. Now, box breathing is one of those things where you can inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, exhale for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds. And what that will do is it'll start calming down your sympathetic nervous system and engaging your parasympathetic nervous system. That's one way that can really help you out. Another one is calling a loved one. When we call a loved one, we really just are taking a big metaphorical bucket of sand, if you will, and we're just dumping it out. And we really want them to just soothe us before they solve our issues. So that's one of those ways that you can de-escalate yourself, is calling someone and venting it out. We don't necessarily want people to solve our issues right away. We want them to soothe us. And then 2 other things are just brisk exercise, going for just a little bit of a walk, and then also getting out in nature. So those are some of the ways that you can slow things down and de-escalate yourself before it becomes a bigger issue. And one last thing I'll just say about that is if you pause and you take a just nice pause where you are breathing and you're not responding right away, an effective pause, that can really help you in this situation as well. Rich, you have anything to add to that?
I mean, that real fear response, it's a real deal. I've experienced it many times in my life with that patrol, and it takes a lot of effort to kind of get yourself out of those fear responses, to flush those chemicals. And the box breathing really works. Actually, and down and to go to sleep at night, you can practice some box breathing to help you, get back to that parasympathetic nervous system, or you're actually able to fall asleep faster. So it really does work.
Great. All right. Last question here. I have to terminate an employee who I believe might react poorly or even become hostile. How should I handle that conversation safely, and what options do I have to reduce risk for everyone involved? That's a good question. We get that one quite a bit. Rich, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say it's a very good question, and I just want to say this out loud, but trust your gut. You're already having concerns about someone, that alone tells you this conversation is an extra plan. And we like to call it forecasting the storm. And the escalation, we talk about weathering the storm. This is like forecasting the storm through your intuition, getting those bad feelings. It's rarely coming out of the blue. There are some warning signs maybe that you're not picking up on consciously. So really pay attention to that. Some of the biggest mistakes we see organizations make is treating a termination. It's like, a routine HR task instead of having a planned risk managed event. These terminations are one of the highest risk moments in any workplace. They're emotional. And a few things to think about is, don't conduct this conversation in a secluded office or somewhere that limits your ability to get to an exit. Choose a space that's neutral, that's professional, that allows for distance and easy movement. You should never feel boxed in. So make sure that you have easy access to exit. Second, you don't have to do it alone. In a higher risk situation, having a second person present, like another HR person, leadership, or even discreet security nearby, it's not overreacting. It's really responsible. Okay. Well, the support doesn't really need to be visible or confrontational. It just needs to be there in availability. So, and then third, keep the conversation short and cool. This is not a time for debate or justifying issues, not time to argue. That's where we can get more emotional in those moments. Don't escalate it if you don't have. And the longer that these situations or conversations go on, the higher the risk. Fourth, plan your exit in advance. Run these mental rehearsals. Think to yourself, if this goes bad, how am I going to exit? Think about that multi-option response. And just remember, you don't have to do the termination in person. I think that might be just an old school thing that everybody kind of gets locked in. We've always done this in the past. You don't have to do it in person. We've seen a lot of organizations go into more of a virtual termination or over the phone, keeping that person off the property, mailing them their belongings just to reduce that risk, especially when they're showing some signals or red flags in the back.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Rich. And I know it's just, as a police officer, when you and I would show up to some of these terminations, and you can just feel the tension going around the workplace. That's where I encourage people, just like you said, that last part, it might be one of those things where maybe the employee can kind of feel it coming and that this could be an issue. There's nothing saying you can't just let them know later on, hey, you're no longer welcome back here. We're going to send you your stuff, your paycheck, everything, but you're not welcome back on the property. It's one of those things that you can reduce the risk of an incident happening around the workplace. So like Rich was saying with that, I completely agree, is maybe in some terminations, you don't even have that. It's more of a distance one where you're sending them stuff instead of having them in an office where things might get really bad. And Rich, what would you say about if you have an employee and they say, hey, I just want to go out to my car really quick and grab a few things before we start this meeting. What would your thoughts be on that?
My thoughts on that would be absolutely not. And that's where you see people do some really stupid things. They could have access to a weapon right there. So I would do my best to keep them from doing that, get that termination over. And don't ever be afraid to call 911, call in law enforcement for help. And something that you and I had done many times in our career, standby for terminations. Sometimes it was in the room. Sometimes it was on the parking lot. Sometimes it was in an adjacent room. But again, just being there, being available, just in case. We've also had organizations have to hire private security for a period of time and security guards. Typically, we always recommend that 2-week window after termination, especially if there has been threats that have been made, so that they could either watch that suspect or watch that person that was terminated, follow them around, make sure they don't come back to the organization, or just having that physical security on site to that 2-week window to deter anything.
Perfect. Great. Well, thanks for answering those questions with me, Rich. For our listeners, if you have a question, please feel free to email me. And my email is drew@blue-ethos.com. And we will share them on the air in our upcoming episodes. Thanks for spending time with us today on the Iron and Empathy podcast. Remember, strong teams aren't built by toughness alone. They're built when grit is matched with empathy, communication, and psychological safety. Take care of your people, look out for one another, and we'll see you next time.